morning or good afternoon, depending on what side of the country you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us today. We're super excited to talk about ALM 201. Amazing, crazy things happening in this world, which is really making ALM more and more important every day. And we're here to spend some time talking about an advanced level of asset liability management. And I'm really thankful for all of you spending your valuable time with us today. Next slide. All right, so I'm Charlie McQueen, moderator and president of McQueen Financial. Really happy here with me today. We have representatives of our interest rate risk management ALM team. We also have our investment advisory team and our valuation team. All sorts of great things, a great group of people I'm very fortunate to spend time with every day. Real excited that our CECL model has been working so well and adopted by so many of you. Thank you very much for that. We're glad that we're providing some great advice. Lots of valuation activities, lots of investment activities looking to raise liquidity, and especially today, a lot of interest rate risk activities, what we're looking to make sure that we're modeling risk, modeling liquidity, and providing good insights. With that today, I'm joined again with two incredible people. First is Heather Shepperly. Heather, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Charlie. Looking forward to the conversation.
Heather is responsible for our asset liability management, interest rate risk area, and all things that come and go in data and reports. Heather runs an incredible team. She's been with us for a wonderful number of years. I'm not saying long because that means how old I am, so I'm not saying that. But with us for a long time and has an incredible team that works with her. And thank you, Heather, for spending the time and really following the passion of education that we all have here at McQueen Financial.
My pleasure.
We're also, Heather is joined by our next slide here, Jim Matthews. Dr. Jim, as we refer to call him, professor, I should say, not doctor, he's a professor. But want to be thankful to have you here, Jim. Your knowledge of ALM, finer, minute details of the market and interest rates and all things math-based. So, Jim, really appreciate you coming here. Jim has been with us for a number of years also, and really thankful to have Jim join us here and give some of his expertise. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you, Heather.
All right, so a little bit of admin stuff here, guys. If you move the mouse around your screen, you will see Q&A and chat. Don't use chat. I won't pay attention to that very well, but if you use Q&A, if you have a question, please click on that, enter in your question. We will be answering questions throughout the webinar if it makes sense, if it's a logical time to ask it. If not, please still feel free to put the questions in there, and I'll be asking Jim and Heather questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, today's webinar is being recorded. And also on top of that, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, please reach out to your MFA advisor and they'll be happy to share a copy of it. Further, our recording will be on our website, our new improved website. Really excited with the look. It'll also be on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to hop in there and look at all the other education we provide also. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Heather. Take it away.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into ALM. A few months ago, we did an ALM 101. We're going to do a small recap of what that looked like, because that's going to tie right into the next part of our conversation, which is getting into our model assumptions, and that's looking at our prepay speeds, our non-maturity deposit retention, betas, or as you sometimes hear them referred to as rate sensitivity factors, or RSF, our repricing or our replacement rates. What are we putting on the books going forward? And tying all of those things together gets us down to talking about our margin and our spread. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end of that. So Jim, could you give us a little bit more information, kind of a recap of what we did talk about in the 101 before we dive into the 201?
Absolutely, Heather. Well, we defined what ALM is, which is important, and why we do actually run the ALM reports, what is involved in performing the ALM analysis, and then the two key metrics that we always like to take away when we evaluate our ALM reports. They are net interest income and net economic value of equity.
Yeah, Jim, those two themes are so incredibly important, and really diving in further about what impacts our net interest income and what impacts NEIV. And the one thing that we did talk about in the 101 is ALM is a little bit of science and a little bit of art. So we did talk a lot about the science. We tipped our toes a little bit into the art part in the 101, but today is going to be a much deeper dive into that concept. And when we look at ALM, what is ALM? It is that art of managing the mix of volume and interest rate sensitivity of our sources and our uses of our funds, and the purposes of controlling interest rate risk and providing constant positive net interest margin. And in order to do that, the two major themes that we are focusing on is our assets and liabilities, our interest sensitive pieces. And we're going to go back to that visual of that teeter totter. So when we look at liabilities, we're looking at non-maturity deposits, term deposits, and borrowings, everything tied to an interest rate. And on our assets is our loans, investments, and overnight funds. And again, that teeter totter, what's that balance between both sides of the balance sheet? And how does the art part or the assumptions going in start to bend and twist and move that teeter totter one direction or another? And that's what our focus point of today is going to be. So really having a good background of what this is going to help us understand next steps.
Absolutely. So why do we run quarterly ALM? Well, it seemed like a couple of years ago we could run it annually, right? And there wasn't much change. And last year it seems like we needed to run it every single month because the market changed. The Fed was hiking every 6 weeks, hiking profoundly, right? So the frequency of ALM really is to capture changes on our balance sheet, namely deposit runoff, which has been a big issue over the past half a year or so, and also loan demand, which was very, very big during the pandemic, which is kind of curtailed a little bit right now. And then we mix in the market, right? The yield curve had been steep and now it's inverted, and it's gone from deeply inverted to a little bit less inverted now. So all of these things are going to affect both the value of our institution in the base case and in the rate shocks, and also the earnings that we can garner from our balance sheet in the given base case and the rate shocks.
Yep, it's definitely important. It's definitely important right now as things are changing so vastly. So how do we go about this, Jim?
Okay, well, ALM is a snapshot of your balance sheet from the evaluation date, right? The regulatory metric is no growth, right? So it's a static balance sheet, just replacement volume through time as assets and liabilities run off. A growth assumption can be run, typically around budget time. We do that to put in target balances and any kind of strategies that we have over the next 12 months. And, and any other what if simulations that can be run, we would do on our ALM simulator. So there's a number of different ways to perform ALM, the regulatory metric, and then really the forecasting metric that we really see it adds so much value to our institution.
It gives us a great baseline as our starting point, and then incorporating in these dynamic themes to see how we're impacted. So getting into these next steps of what is our two main focus points of this test. So going into net interest income.
Yes, and this is the reward side of the equation, and Heather's going to cover the risk side in just a moment. But net interest income is all of our interest income minus our interest expense, right? Our balance sheet income over the next 12 months, right? So we solve for the base case, and we see on our chart here, the base case 44,158,000. And then we see what happens when we do our instantaneous permanent parallel rate shocks, that income actually goes down a little bit as rates rise. It comes up a little bit as rates decrease, right? That's our sensitivity. That's the mismatch between assets and liabilities repricing. And then we always like to look at the limit that we have, our policy limits, and how we compare to those policy limits. And for this chart here, it looks pretty good. Everything is within our policy limit, and we look at the trend on the bottom and been within our policy limit. So this is really an exemplary outcome of what we would like to see with net interest income.
So net interest income is extremely important. That's one of the first main tests, as Jim has referred to. And then the second piece is getting into the value side. So this is net economic value of equity, or also referred to as NEIV. And this is a really important, this very first bullet point, I want you to focus on and keep this in mind as we get further into this discussion today. Our NEIV is market value of assets minus market value of liabilities. What is remaining is our equity position. And so the more we take away is what you're remaining is that smaller amount. So the lower those liability values are, the more leftover equity we have. And that's actually a boost. So that's that counterintuitive side. But as we value every moving part of the balance sheet and all of those interest sensitive pieces, we're looking at what is that impact to our principal cash flow based off of those par values of each of those products. What is the interest cash flow that ties to this based off of those coupon rates and maturity dates, the discount rate that helps us value these products, and what does that impact look like? And this is showing us what this risk looks like right now, testing this against policy just to make sure that the decisions we're making are appropriate for our balance sheet. So when we look at Neve, it can be a little counterintuitive in certain sections and not the most easy concept to understand. So from a visual standpoint, going back to that teeter-totter, we're looking at our Neve assets, just this concept of the longer these assets are, the more sensitivity this is going to hold. And the shorter those durations are, the less sensitivity that holds. And that's an important piece to keep in the back of our mind when looking at these next pages. And liabilities being that opposite, the lower these numbers are in these up scenarios, the less we're taking away from assets, leaving us a higher equity position. So always keep that in mind, that liability is the opposite direction.
So just for a summary with the ALM 101, before we move on to the ALM 201, we don't want to think of ALM as a regulatory burden, right? We don't want to just get this report and throw it in a file cabinet and wait for our examiner to show up and have him use it as a doorstop, right? We want to be proactive with ALM, right? We really want to anticipate our ALM report, right? Ideally, and we get that result. We talk with our advisor, and we generate ideas, right, for the current quarter and for the current year coming up. Anything that we need to change, right? ALM, we can see the impact of new loan types, of new investment types, of new funding products, right? We can assess whether we can take more risk. Again, that goes back to the policy limits and the amount of risk we have and the amount of reward we have also. And we can stay ahead of potential problems by modeling all of these different scenarios.
So as we get into 201, the second layer of things is looking at the model assumptions that go in. And these are extremely important because these do tie and change what your net interest income sensitivity looks like and what Neve looks like. So the few moving pieces we're going to focus on today is our prepayment speeds, non-maturity deposit retention, those betas, rate sensitivity factors, repricing, because the important part of all of this is accurate assumptions gives us an accurate result. So we can truly understand where our position is so that we can plan for that future from that strategic approach. And then at the end, just really doing kind of a recap of all of those moving pieces and the impact to our margin and to our spread. So Jim, tell us a little bit about this very first piece, which we're going to dive into, which is prepay speeds. What are those?
Okay. Well, they're a behavioral assumption. How's that sound? So, we have mortgages on our balance sheet now. We have a number of different loan types that are subject to prepayment speed, but mortgage is the big one, right? Because it's a very elongated cash flows contractually, but we know behaviorally they are much shorter, right? So how do we determine reasonableness for a 30-year mortgage, right? In an example. So we use what's known as CPRs, and there's a couple different ways to do this, but we use CPRs. And CPR stands for conditional prepayment rate, and it's also referred to as a constant prepayment rate, right? And both of those definitions really are suitable, right? We established the CPR because the condition, right, the coupon on our loan versus the prevailing market rate, right? A year and a half ago, we're making 3% mortgages in a 3% rate environment. Now we've got these legacy 3% mortgages in a 6.5% rate environment, right? So we know those CPRs have slowed down tremendously, right? But the condition of being in a 6.5% environment with that 3% mortgage is what's driving the CPR change, right? And then it's constant because once we establish a CPR in the base case and in the rate shocks, be it higher or lower rate shock, we hold that constant, that assumption constant for the life of those cash flows. until the next quarter when we establish a whole new set of CPRs, right? So it's constant for the quarter, but it's for the life of the loans, right? The analysis takes into account that that CPR does not change once it's established, and it is conditionally established with depending on where we are, coupon versus refi rate or current market rate, right? So the CPR is the annual percentage of principal payments received over and above contractually scheduled principal payments. Heather's going to show us some literal CPRs in just a moment. And when we see that number, it's the percentage above the contractual payment over the life of that loan, right? Most recently, we do some in-house study here. We do prepayment analysis for clients. And with that big run-up that we had, excuse me, the rundown we had in rates, a lot of refinancing took place. 90% of the speed that we saw, observed speed, is from refinancing. Only 10% was additional principal payments, right? Now, we don't have any incentive to make additional principal payments now if we have a 3% mortgage and a 6.5% environment. So we expect this to stay about the same. Probably not a whole lot of refi going on either. But this was eye-opening to me, right? That 90 to 10 ratio, refi to extra principal payments, but either one of those events manifests in a CPR, right? And again, I mentioned the speeds are updated every quarter once we do the report to capture the current market activity and also the current market condition.
Yeah, Jimmy, you bring up such a good point with this is the market will really drive how this activity is occurring and that importance of updating this each quarter when we go to run this study, because these prepays do change over time. Like we had mentioned with that movement of the market, it was very heavy on the refinance side. Every institution activity looks a little bit different and each market is going to look a little different. But knowing that the refinancing side is really most of where those speeds are derived from. And depending on what the market's giving us, that's really going to drive how fast those payments are going to occur. So basically looking at this entire moving part, we have that incentive to refinance. What are the rates doing? What is our driver here? So the lower rates are, faster the speeds are. And looking at 2020 was a prime example of that. And higher rates equal lower speeds. Again, we were able to experience that in 2022. And so what's happening here is you can see that these record low interest rates really gave us a very high incentive to refinance. I think most people did if they were in a position to be able to do that in something such as a mortgage. So a lot of people really took full advantage of this very low interest rate environment, which caused those speeds to skyrocket. Now we have experienced a complete opposite of that in 2022, as we saw rates increase significantly and then incentive to refinance to drop significantly. Many people are in that position where they refinanced in 21, end of 2020, and they're going to hold steady and not do anything with those loans. So because of that, you are seeing a little bit of a flooring of speeds. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that soon. But this is that concept of higher rates, slower speeds, lower rates, higher speeds. So as we come to this page here, you can really see what that impact looks like. And as you look at NEV and our value, that's going to shift and change based off of the duration of our balance sheet. So when you look in these down scenarios or lower rates, as rates go down, those prepay speeds are going to speed up. When they speed up, that shortens our cash flow and lowers our risk position because we can respond to the market a little bit faster and take advantage of those scenarios versus higher rates and slower speeds is going to lengthen out that cash flow, causing a little bit higher risk because we're holding on to those loans for a longer period of time. You're not going to see those new ones go on the books at those higher rates. So this is where that teeter-totter comes into play, how that shift and bend and movement tips it in one direction or another. So getting a little bit more granular and looking at these actual speeds, different asset classes are going to have different responses to the market. So some are inherently fast, like our auto loans. Auto loans historically prepay very quickly. In a normal situation, we usually see these somewhere between 25 to 30%. Over the last year or so, we had actually two themes going on. We had one where we had these record high rates, which inherently causes slower speeds, but we also had a supply and demand issue. Cars were difficult to come by. So those speeds dropped significantly into about the upper teens. We're starting to see those things pick back up again. But again, that importance of doing this and updating this on a quarterly basis, capturing what's currently going on. We have other items that are a little bit slower prepays. Mortgages right now have slowed significantly based off of everything that we just were talking about, that difference of those record low rates. Because of that, we have to make sure that we're capturing some floor speeds. We know that we're never going to see prepayments go to zero. We do need to capture some kind of speed here. You're always going to have that turnover occurring on our balance sheet. So making sure that we're stopping those out and capturing those speeds. So flooring is something that's going to be a big piece of this conversation today for many reasons. And this is one of those examples. These speeds are going to floor and they're going to stop slowing. And this is what we're seeing in these up scenarios simply because of the market of where we are right now. And other items such as indirect lending versus direct lending. Indirects tend to pay a little bit slower than our directs, and then unsecured products, a little bit less incentive there. Those are usually naturally higher interest rates, so those aren't going to pay as quickly. So different asset classes will have different speeds, and it's extremely important to ensure we've captured proper speeds for our proper pieces of the puzzle to make sure that our cash flow is correct, our sensitivity is correct, and this helps drive those assumptions.
Excellent point, Heather. So with regard to prepayment speeds, the questions that we need to ask ourselves, are the speeds reasonable and supportable for our balance sheet? Right? Reasonableness is the key. And as Heather mentioned, we had a big profound change in the market. We would expect these base case prepayments to be much lower now than they were a year ago. It's reasonable to assume that. It's also reasonable to assume that we're going to floor sooner in rising rate scenarios, than we would have a year ago, right? And in the declining rate scenarios, we would expect a big ramp up, right? If we went down 400 basis points, there's some pent up demand to refinance. So, all of that would go into a reasonable outcome as far as, looking at supporting our prepayment speeds in all these different scenarios. Is our experience as a bank or credit union different than the general market, right? And we see that geographically all the time. We've got some clients out west that, a normal mortgage for them is like a super jumbo, right? So they pay very, very differently than a mortgage in the Midwest would when we have different rate scenarios, right? So, we need to think about our balance sheet versus the general market, because a lot of times there can be some differences there. And, are we being asked by the examiners to support our speeds, to have them studied and to make sure that the prepayment assumption in the model is really tractable to our experience over, the past year or so, right? So those are three things that we really need to think about with prepayments.
Great points, Jim. Thank you. So as we move on to our next step, we're now going to start talking a little bit more about non-maturity deposits, or NMD retention. So Jim, tell us a little bit about what this means for us.
Well, boy, it means everything right now, Heather.
Definitely agree with that statement.
Yeah,
Definitely agree with that statement.
They've hiked rates 475 basis points. We're expecting another hike next week, right? And we haven't moved our non-maturity deposits anywhere near that much, right? So what had been very, very inconsequential franchise value a year and a half ago, right? Fed funds were 0 to 0.25. It's about what we're paying on our shares. Now we have hundreds of basis points in value in our non-maturity deposits versus the alternative funding costs. So yeah, NMDs are everything right now, and there's a lot of pressure on deposits, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But these NMDs are our franchise value. It's a stable, low-cost funding source below market funding. We're making market-based loans, we're making market-based investments, but we have below market funding, right? So that's where a lot of the value on our balance sheet is. Right, because we go out to borrow or we issue CDs in the market, brokered CDs, they are very expensive right now, right? And when we talk about non-maturity deposits, this is all of our funding that doesn't have a discrete maturity date, right? Like share CDs have a maturity date, term borrowings have a maturity date. The NMDs are non-interest bearing accounts, checking accounts, savings accounts, the individual retirement without a maturity, and also our money market products on the balance sheet. So what are we seeing with non-maturity deposit retention? Well, when we run core deposit studies that go back 5 years, it's a 5-year regression analysis. We're certainly seeing fewer accounts, but larger balances, right? We've seen deposits. It seems every single year our balance sheet has been growing, right? So, but yet we have, fewer accounts. Some of these accounts decay off, but we've got larger balances in the remaining accounts. And by and large, longer retention of core deposits. And we've got a couple of asterisks there because that has changed really since last June, last September. We have seen drawdowns in deposits after what had been many, many years of deposit growth, right? So this is why we're kind of keying on deposit retention right now. And if we were to run a core deposit study, we would probably still see a little bit of an increase from last year's study, or if we did a study 2 or 3 years ago, because it's a 5-year look back. So, the past 6 months is only 1/10 of the data we're analyzing, right? So, we really have to be cognizant of what's going on right now, because, it belies what we're seeing from an empirical standpoint when we go back in a time series, namely 5 years, to explore our non-maturity deposits.
And Jimmy makes such a fantastic point in regards to how fast things can change and how not always do these studies reflect the activity that's happening right now. So retention does change over time. And we have two really types of deposits when looking at non-maturities. We have our sticky versus more of the rate shopping types of items. So what we mean by that is sticky deposits are our kind of our core, our non-interest bearing deposits, checking accounts, savings accounts, versus rate shoppers are higher price, usually more tier structure products such as money markets and IRAs. So keeping those things in mind, we want to look at what do we utilize as our retention for non-maturity deposits, as this, as we have stated, holds so much value when looking at NEAV. So when we use these studies, we have to default to general market consensus items or assumptions that are approved and accepted by examiners as a standard conservative approach, realistic expectations. And as a standard, that's usually somewhere around 4 years, which is extremely conservative. So what we tend to look at and see is when we run these studies, we identify how long do our deposits stay with us and use that output to help us properly make decisions on if we need to increase that 4 years to maybe 5 or even 6 or 7. We don't need to go completely out to these terms that we see, like example, the savings account showing a retention of 19 years. This is a very common output, and we see this all the time. But examiners do not like to see anything more than 10 years. They generally don't accept that. So what we have to utilize this information for is to make sure we are reasonable and supportable and defendable about what our assumptions look like. So when we were in 2020, we're doing that 5-year look back. You can see these terms were a little bit on the shorter end in comparison to what we ended up identifying in 2022 by doing that 5-year look back. Now, we can use this as a guide as our starting point, but the thing to remember is things change very quickly. So let's utilize what we can see from what happened in 2020 as that look back period, knowing that what was going on over the last few years, we did see deposits sitting and staying for a long period of time, which caused us to get a little longer. But now we're seeing that start to get shorter again. So we can use the core deposit study to increase some of those terms slightly, but still be defendable. And that's extremely important here, utilizing these tools and valuing these in the right way. And you can really start to see this as you start to see the impact and the change. So here's a great example of how non-maturity deposits holds a large amount of value on NEV, and those longer durations equals less sensitivity when looking at a situation like an up 300. We tend to focus on that. That's usually where examiners are honed in on, is a plus 300 shock scenario. And that's what this is reflecting. So as an example, we did a core deposit study on a balance sheet and found that those deposits looked similar to the numbers that we just saw on the previous page. So we're not going to bump those up to 9, 10 years, but we're going to jump up to maybe 5 or 6 or 7. And just by adding that little bit of duration, there was a large impact to our risk position. And as a standard, we see a lot of times a policy limit on NEV and a plus 300, usually at negative 30%, say. So for this balance sheet, we could have been outside of policy at negative 36.7, but we were able to do a study and confirm that we find that our non-maturity deposits stay around longer than that. So we're going to lengthen them out slightly. And that was enough to actually probably bring us back within policy. And this is a common activity that we see, not to say we have to do that whole exercise, but at least knowing and understanding the activity that we're seeing on our balance sheet, making sure that that duration that we're assuming or conservative approach here is appropriate for us, and being able to justify those changes, because this could make a big impact on whether we're within policy or not. And for some of us, that's very important, especially right now. So, Jim, we talked a little bit about the funding sources and how expensive those can be. And as a slight example here of the difference between a core deposit and what that valuation does versus a funding source that's inherently a little bit more expensive, we were looking at that difference. So back to that counterintuitive approach on liabilities when coming to NEV, what this is showing us is how much are we going to reduce our liabilities against our assets with that remaining equity position. And when we look at a core deposit, you can see in a plus 300 that that value is 90%. So we're still giving an extra boost to that bottom line versus a funding source that's only at 94%. So Jim, the term on this wasn't very long on a funding source, and even just showing that difference between the two, that was a little bit on the shorter end, correct?
About 3 years, I think we used for the funding source. But yeah, we do see that that value that the core deposits bring to us. Again, a discount liability is akin to a premium asset, because we take market value of assets minus market value of liabilities. So yeah, this is very beneficial, having those core deposits. And Heather, as you mentioned, they are much, much cheaper than a term funding, right?
Right. So as we talk about funding and cost and making sure we're pricing appropriately, that really gets us into our betas and rate sensitivity factors, how fast we're repricing as that market shifts. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what this means to us?
Absolutely. So a beta is our response to a change in rates, right? Then when we think about the model, we're moving 100 basis point rate shock, and that used to be huge until the Fed was hiking 75 basis points every 6 weeks, right? That kind of brought everything home to us. But for example,
A little different.
model, yeah, exactly. When summer of 300 basis point rate hikes, yeah. So, we think in 100 basis point iterations, right? When we do our rate shocks. So, what do we pass along per every 100 basis points? Well, it depends on the product type, whether it's fixed or whether it's variable, whether caps and floors play a role, and certainly periodic caps, which are much more of a constraint than a lifetime cap, in rising rate scenarios. So, yeah, variability is tremendous. And when we look at, well, I guess the next slide, we're going to look at loans, right?
Yeah. And Jimmy, bring up a really great point when looking at caps and floors. So when we look at these types of products, it's really important because that is going to change how our risk could look. And it's actually causing some interesting movements, such as non-linear, meaning that as rates go up, you're going in one direction. And as rates go down, you would assume you would be going in the opposite direction. But not always is that the case. And this right here is kind of the reason why some of those things are occurring. So when we look at variable rate loans, these move in lockstep with the market. They're generally tied to an index, something such as prime, and they're going to move right in lockstep as that market moves, or as Jim has referred to, the Fed moving 100 basis points. The assumption is these loans are going to move 100 basis points. Well, that is true up until you take a few of these things into consideration. So when we look at a floor, for instance, our mortgage variable products have a minimum of 2.77% on average. And so with that being said, we are going to take some advantage of that in a down scenario because we do have to hit a floor. We're not going to get a continuous reduction of that income. So we start off at a replacement of a 563, rates go down 100 basis points. So we're going to match, go down 100 basis points. We go down another 100 basis points, we're going to match. But once we get to the down 300, we can't do that full movement because we've reached that floor. So from a risk standpoint, this holds benefit on the income because we're not reducing 100 and 100. But the opposite side of that is taking into consideration caps. We have our lifetime cap where the overall rate can get up to 11.93%, but we don't have enough room to get there. So what actually comes first is your periodic cap, meaning that we can only move rates 2% over the next 12 months if the market moved 2% or higher. So with that being said, we're getting benefit in the down for income, but unfortunately, we're not going to get that same benefit as rates go up. This is what's causing some nonlinear movements. And this is a big part of it on variable rate assets, but we're also going to talk a little bit more about the deposit side of what that's causing as well. So when we look at fixed rate products, this is a lot easier to see and understand. So as rates go up and down, you're only seeing about 75% of the market movement instead of that full 100.
Heather, I'm going to cut in here real quick before you go to fixed rate and go back to floating rate for a second. And
Sure.
before I answer the question here, we do have a public service announcement. There's a problem with the Q&A button. It's not working today. We're diagnosing why and speaking with Zoom, so we'll know more later. But if you do have a question, please email it to me, charlie@m-f-a.com, or to Corey@m-f-a.com, and we will get the questions in front of Jim and Heather on a very timely basis. So with that, one of the questions that did come in, does the model account for variable rate loans that have a 2% cap and floors in the 300 and 400 basis point scenarios?
Absolutely. That is a very important piece of proper income simulations, value simulations of capturing those caps and floors. So that is a piece that we want to make sure that we capture. And this is a great example of that, capturing that floor here in that periodic cap where we're going to stop it out over that 12-month time period, because that's what ALM does. It's a 12-month forward projection. So we're going to capture the activity that we're expecting to see or can capture over that time.
And one thing I'll add there, just to add to you guys, unsolicited comment, but to everyone, make sure that's in the data. Make sure you look at your data, you understand your data. If we're not getting the cap and floor information in your loan file, we don't know it's there. And we look and we try to figure this stuff out and we work with you, but make sure you're thinking carefully about the data when you send it to us. So, all right, thank you guys. Go back at it. I'm out of your way.
Great points, Charlie. Thank you very much. And this is a really important piece because, again, accurate assumptions gives us accurate results. And those moving pieces can be very impactful for our balance sheet. So definitely an important aspect to make sure that we're capturing. So Jim, tell us a little bit about how the investments function and work in the beta world.
Absolutely. So again, we've got variable rate investments and they are lockstep with that entire rate shock, right? That 100 basis points is referenced in the diagram we have here. And then we've got fixed rate investments. They move a little bit slower, right? We're doing a 75 beta per 100 with the fixed rate investments, CDs as the proxy example here for that.
All right, now deposit side of the balance sheet looks a little bit different than the asset side.
It does indeed. Yes, Heather. So we know with our checking and our money market examples, we're not going to move 75 basis points. We're not going to move anywhere near that much. As a matter of fact, we might move even less than what we have in the model for the betas, but we have to appease the examiners also, right? We can't get away with saying, oh, up 500, I'm going to move 10 basis points because that's just not going to slide with the examiners, right? So we have to do something that's reasonable. And, if we don't move as much as we have, actually that we have baited in the model, then we're going to outperform our income sim as rates rise. And we've had plenty of clients do that because they've been very, very sticky with regard to the deposits. With the 12-month CDs, our example here, these are share CDs, right? We're thinking about deposits and that 75 beta, we want to keep that congruent with what we have on the asset side of the balance sheet, right? If we're going out and buying CDs as investments and we're assuming they're going up 75 basis points per 100 in a rate shock, we need to assume that our funding is going to move that same amount, right? We don't want to have a situation where we're moving our betas on the liabilities for a product on the liability side less than we do on the asset side, right? So that's something we need to think about in our models, right? Is to keep the betas the same for share CDs as we do for investment CDs.
So Jim, one interesting piece on this page, kind of similar to the variable rate loan that we were looking at, where we're hitting some floors. And this is another piece which is causing some nonlinear movements when looking at a down scenario. And one of the biggest parts of this is because of our non-maturity deposit pricing. As liquidity becomes an issue, the very first place we begin is term liabilities. So we generally are going to start to raise our costs on our term deposits. Well, we are seeing a lot of that right now. We're starting to see non-maturity deposit rates start to come up, but those generally take a little longer to happen. Hence the reason why a little bit slower, lower beta. But what's occurring is we cannot reflect a lower cost of funds as fast as we're seeing a reduction of the asset values. So because of that, again, it's causing some nonlinear movements because we're flooring out and we can't drop below 1 basis point on this non-maturity deposit type product. And then the same may occur on some term deposits. Those are starting to pick back up and level set. We're not seeing as much of that, but the non-maturities are very important. And another exercise you can do to make sure that the betas we're using on these non-maturities make the most sense for us is using the last couple of years as a great example of as rates have moved, or even looking at, say, 2018-19, what were we paying as rates had gone up over 200 basis points? Were we paying 47 basis points on a checking account? If we weren't, then we may need to revise what those betas may look like. Again, like Jim mentioned, we can't go to 0, we can't go to 1. Examiners aren't going to be happy with that. But we can also be a little bit more realistic on what this calculation is showing us. Were we really paying almost 2% on these money markets? So these are the questions we want to ask, and these are the things that we want to look at to make sure that these are reasonable and supportable based off of our response to the market and what our competition is around us as well.
Yeah. Last year was a great textbook year because we had such a profound change in the Fed funds rate. We could think about what we actually did with our repricing versus what we had in the model. Again, as you mentioned, we're probably not going to get away with very, very small betas, but it's informative, right? To look back and see where we were when Fed funds was 0 to 0.25 versus where it is right now.
Such a great tool to have for those decision-making opportunities.
Absolutely. So one of the last bits we're going to be doing here is repricing and replacement rates, right? This is for rollover for our regulatory report and new volume from when we do that dynamic report, right? That budget report with our new target balances, right? But certainly every ALM report we run is going to be impacted with that rollover amount, right? When we have the repricing assumption. And that's really our offering rate, right? Or our net offering rate. We're going to talk about that at the very bottom bullet point, removing dealer fees and indirect loans. But what we need to think about and what the repricing rate is the rate we'll be booking for a given loan type over the next 12 months, right? Are we priced appropriately for the market? Boy, a year and a half ago, there was an answer, yes, we're priced appropriately. Now, with the fact that rates are much, much higher, with the fact that a lot of our institutions are running out of these core deposits, right? The very cheap source of funding. We have to go out and procure wholesale funding in the market. That's hundreds of basis points higher, right? So appropriate pricing, very, very important. We have to keep an eye on the competition also. What is the competition doing? Are we priced appropriately for our market? Does our market vary from the national market? And you'd be surprised that it certainly does for many cases, right? And we priced appropriately for our cost of funds. How is the institution down the street still showing 2 3/4% on an auto loan when we're at 8%, right? Well, hopefully they're not at 2 3/4 anymore because they'd be deeply underwater. But we can't always just look at the competition and say, yeah, their rate is right for my institution because their deposit base may be different, right? Or they may be mispricing something and we don't want to emulate their mistake, right? And again, the last bit is we want to have the net yield to us in our repricing, exclusive of any kind of dealer fees or any kind of commissions that are paid out to bring that loan onto our books.
Jim, this is such a great point with this is are we appropriate for our market? This is something that we talked about in the 101 of understanding our competition because every institution varies so differently and somebody next door to you can have a completely different structure. So what they're doing may not necessarily correlate to what we should be doing. So just understanding what that looks like for us is so vastly important.
Absolutely. So we have an example here right out of the model on the right-hand side here. Booked rate is the current portfolio rate. The replacement rates are net rates. If there's something with regard to the used auto, if there's some kind of dealer reserve or something, but we see the profound difference between our current portfolio rate and our replacement rates. And this is indicative of an environment where rates have moved up a tremendous amount in a short period of time, right? We see our 30-year mortgages, our booked rate, our portfolio rate's just under 4%, and our replacement rate is 7 3/8, right? So big difference there. And that's going to give us upwardly sloping income over the 12 months to the extent that we have repricing taking place on the balance sheet. So how did our replacement rates get so much higher than our portfolio rate, particularly if our liabilities are only up 15 or 20 basis points or maybe 30 basis points from where they were a year ago? Well, we're going to look at the build-up method, and Charlie came out with this. This looks probably very familiar. This is something that we put out as an advisor talking point. When we think about how do we price when we run out of this natural resource on the liability side of the balance sheet, our deposits, right? Risk-free treasury rate example is 4%. That might even be 100 basis points higher right now. Our CECL allowance for that given loan type, throw it on the pile. The credit spread, right? Are we doing B credit? Are we doing C credit? We need to allow for that. A servicing of that loan, right? Take 50 basis points for that. And then our ROA or ROE, right? Return on equity, return on assets. We don't want to make a loan that's dilutive to our current financial ratio, right? So in this example, that's about 100 basis points. So this is how we get to our 7.5% auto loan, right? Because we're using 4% as that risk-free rate, or an alternative funding cost even, right? As opposed to 40 or 50 basis points where we may be funding on ourselves on the liability side of the balance sheet. So this is how rates go up so much so fast, that replacement rate versus our current portfolio rate.
Yeah, I was very happy to see some of these things starting to catch up right now because for a while there, we were kind of being a little bit reserved, especially when pricing our loans. So it's very nice to see that as we're getting into March and starting to see some of that activity, we are starting to reflect that higher market, really incorporating this build-up method to ensure that we've got a proper margin and spread. So as we get into some of these trends, you can see some really nice trend analysis on how things have changed over time, making sure we're doing the right things. So you can see overnight funds has really skyrocketed. That's a much higher yield here, but making sure that we're continuing to take full advantage of those loans and, done some nice opportunity here, making sure we're watching for those forward projections. This is that 1 year forward, assuming based off of all those assumptions that we put in, making sure that that is where we can go with this. That is where some of these opportunities are. And then as we get down into our costs, this is where you really want to look at, are these trends going in the right direction? Are we taking advantage of those proper opportunities? And a great example of that is looking at our deposit cost structure. So maybe we look at this graph and find that our overall term borrowings are very high. We've incorporated these, but this is an important balance of our balance sheet, making sure that we've got some funding as needed. Liquidity has been an issue, so borrowing's been a good opportunity, especially when you have some nice high yields on those loans, you're still going to earn a spread. but do we have different opportunities? If by looking at that forward projection, it looks like we may not have our term deposits priced appropriately, is it time for us to start to bump up some of those rates? We may not have to rely on those deposits nearly, or those, I'm sorry, borrowings nearly as much. We may need to have that opportunity to raise some of the costs on our term side, which isn't as reflected immediately on those non-maturities. We start to bump up some of our checking accounts and savings accounts. That expense is going to be responded immediately versus as we breathe on those term deposits, we can control and slow down that rising expense. So these are those opportunities we can really take a look at those trends and those movements. And do we have the proper structures going forward, assumptions going forward that's going to put us in the right position? So this is some great information and trends we can see on, did we make the right decisions? Are we in the right place? And where are those opportunities?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when we think about spread and margin, great graph here on the bottom for net interest spread. We see asset yield is ascending, right? We see liabilities are coming up a little bit, but not to the extent that the asset are repricing, right? So we see that gray line, our net interest spread, is going in the right direction. It's going higher, right? And we see on the bar graph, same situation, right? That the higher rate environment has allowed us to recapture some of what had been a suppressed net spread in that very low rate environment we had during the pandemic, right? So we're kind of normalizing, if you will. Our balance sheet is taking a deep breath, right? But the one risk to this favorable spread and margin over time is, losing some of those very, very low cost deposits and having to go in and, as Heather just articulated, do some term funding, be it share CDs where we pay quite a bit more, or, going out and getting borrowings where we pay quite a bit more than a share CD oftentimes, right? So, it's been a good impact on the balance sheet, certainly for now, right? The assets have repriced faster than our liabilities have. But now perhaps that stretched slinky, if you will, if I go back to my 1960s toy box, is starting to, we've got it stretched out. Now the liabilities are starting to catch up to the front of our slinky now, right? So we've got to manage that as we go on, as we have this prolonged higher rate environment.
I love that analogy. Right. So just as a recap of the things that we talked about today is, asking ourselves, are our assumptions reasonable and supportable for us? Are the prepay speeds, the general market prepay speeds appropriate? Are we getting pressure from examiners saying, the activity that we're seeing is very different. We may want to relook at that, make sure that the speeds are appropriate for our balance sheet. Looking at non-maturity retention terms, does this make sense for us? Or do we find that they are inherently much longer and maybe we're not reflecting as much value that these may hold? Making sure our betas are correct. Are we capturing all those caps and floors and all those opportunities? We may be stuck here, but we have more of an opportunity there. We want to make sure that how we reprice and how we respond to the market is being captured correctly. So we can really see that impact to margin and spread over time as well. And making sure our repricing rates make sense, that accurate assumptions, again, are accurate results, which is a great starting point for us. And I love this picture, this crystal ball, Jim. I know we brought this up in the 101, kind of bringing it back to us to here today, really gives us kind of that same look, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is at the end of the day. It's the art and the science, but the art is such a big, big part of that, getting those assumptions right. When we think about prepayment speeds, what is germane to our balance sheet, our experience, right? The non-maturity deposit retention terms, what's happened historically, but what's happening right now. The betas are always important when we're looking at non-base case rate environment outcomes. And repricing rates, right? If we're doing credit scoring, we don't want to use the repricing rate for our A credit auto loans. If we think we're going to be doing much more of B and C lending, let's get that higher repricing rate to reflect what we think is going to be the average rate over the next 12 months on that input sheet so we can get it in the model, right? So yeah, again, the repricing rates, that might be the biggest element of that crystal ball is, that run-on rate for replacement volume that we experience every single time we run an ALM report. We have to get those repricing rates right.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just kind of tying everything we discussed in 101 was really understanding net interest income and NAV. Now that we understand the model assumptions and that art part behind the scenes, now we can take that correct, accurate output, use that crystal ball, and start planning strategically for the future. What does our balance sheet position? Is it now? Where are those opportunities? Are we making the right decisions for what we're trying to reach in the future as we get further into the year, and then budgeting season as we get into the fall, utilizing this tool to be able to make those decisions for the future.
Wow, we're here. You guys covered a lot of material. Love it.
All
right.
Important.
Yeah, it really is, and it's exciting. And I appreciate the text questions that came in. So thank you all. We just have a couple, and we'll wrap things up so everyone get off to their next meetings at the top of the hour. One of the questions that was asked was about pledged securities. How do people share with us pledged security information?
So, Jim, if it's okay, I'll take this. So as an ALM client, we provide to you what's called an ALM input sheet. And there's a section on that document that is in regards to this piece specifically. So having that information in there is very important. We want to make sure when we run things such as your liquidity stress ratio, we want to incorporate those pieces to make sure that our calculation is capturing every moving piece that's going to tell us a proper liquidity position. So it's a very important piece to have in there, and that is communicated via the input sheet that is provided on a quarterly basis.
Yep, and I appreciate that, Heather. I think some of the theory of the question also went into that is utilized for the liquidity section, as I think they're looking at, and well, obviously getting the data is really important, but that's something I think is going to get a lot more examiner scrutiny here as we look forward. So we really want to make sure everyone understands that number.
Yes.
Next question came in was about the loan pricing document, and it was really 7.5% is a normal rate for loans.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You can watch TV and see Toyota giving 3.99% on their Tacomas, right? But they're a manufacturer. They're building that vehicle and they need to sell it, right? So their cost of funds or their, out the door loan price is going to be very, very different than your institution, particularly if you have to go out and procure wholesale funding, right? If you're getting to the point where you're pretty low on deposits, you're already in a borrowing position, that incremental dollar that you have to bring onto the balance sheet to fund that loan has to be priced into that loan. So yeah, it's very, very possible to be a 7.5% environment for many, many loans. Not so much mortgage loans. I mean, you probably can't get away with that in many markets. But when we think about shorter consumer loans, right, where the big elongated cash flows aren't as big a deal. It's just being able to hear yes from your loan officer and to get back to the dealership and buy that car that you want. That 7.5 could easily be your auto loan.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. Another question that came in related to that was, wow, it was the phrase. I'm going to paraphrase this here a little bit. But it's an interesting issue when we talk about borrowing rates and bringing on loans. And I'm going to kind of answer this and ask it a little bit both, but it was an interesting thing. Looking at your incremental cost of borrowing, it's very high today versus where loan rates are in a lot of places. And as I looked at this, it was an interesting structure as I thought about this. If you are getting deposits from your local client base, membership, whatever it may be, and customer base or membership, if you're lending to that group, it's a fairly balanced activity. But it becomes interesting is if you're taking deposits from your local base and then using that to lend in other parts of the country or state or buy loans or indirect lending, there tends to be a bit of a mismatch there. And I think people really need to take a very close look that they understand the incremental cost of borrowing to ensure that they're marking their loan rates appropriately from that buildup that Jim and Heather went through. So I answered that. We'll leave it at that. So with that, last but not least, I had a question of thank you for the loan pricing. So thank you for that comment. Appreciate that. It's a really important thing I think everyone should take away from this. Lots of important things, but one of the things that I definitely want to make sure we take away is thinking about your loan pricing and structure. And I love the comments about it doesn't mean if someone else is doing it, it's a good idea to do it. I don't want to jump off the bridge if someone else does. So with that, thank you, Heather. Wonderful. Really appreciate all your insight and information. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for joining. Love the conversation.
Yeah, great conversation. Jim, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Heather.
All right, and coming up next is going to be our Investments 201 webinar. It's on May 10th from 2 to 3 p.m. as we continue our 101 and 201 series. And just to give everyone a little bit of foreshadowing, there might even be a 301 series this year. This might be an interesting year, something new that's being talked about. But with that, thank you all for joining us today. And again, please go to our website, new and improved website, to see all of our webinars and all of our information and to register for them, and also to see our previous webinars. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.